So when we say that selection is an art and a science, it gets thrown around a lot if you talk to people who work in sort of the assessment world. The key here, though, what we really mean is that it can't be one or the other. So you can't just use the science side of things. So say you use an assessment or a market survey or something like that based on someone's experience. It's not enough. So every selection process to really give us a holistic understanding of a candidate, and really if we can predict their success on the job, we need the science and the art. So the science, as I mentioned, is really all about that objective piece, so the data that we have on somebody. If we are using a pre-employment assessment, if we're using a screening process, if we're using a market survey, those give us data points that we know are hard, they're objective, and they show us the science side of a candidate. And then the art side is really all about the behavioral interview and the structured interview and their fit, with the environment and the manager. And when we combine the two together, it's so much more powerful and can be so much more predictive of a candidate's success on the job. And at the end of the day, that's all we want to do in a selection process. We want to know if this person can do the job. And we always say we want to know if they can do it, if they will do it, and if they'll do it here. So you really want to use your science to identify if they can do it, so if they have those traits, that DNA, to really be successful. You use your interview to identify if they will do it. So you look at the behavioral piece, the attitudes, and then the fit is that sort of unstructured intuition, or we call it validated intuition, to really make sure that they'll do it and they'll do it here. There are many different ways that you can use the science of selection really to your advantage in your recruitment process. And it's all about adding value. So we want to add value to what you're already doing in your process by bringing in the objective can-do of that can-do, will-do, here equation that we talked about. So we use this science piece to really identify if a candidate has the potential to perform on the job based on what we know of strong performers in the industry, and even as granular as on your team or in your organization. And that DNA really shows us the potential of them in the future, and we can use that also to inform us what investments we need to make in this candidate to ensure that this potential turns into performance. So if we see that somebody prefers a really structured environment and they prefer lots of feedback and they really enjoy a collaborative workplace, then for this candidate to be successful, we might look at something like teaming and getting them onboarded with a team that works with them on a regular basis, as opposed to someone who might prefer to be independent and work in an unstructured world, and they might be sort of a more traditional role who's out there doing field sales. So taking that time to use this science to not only qualify the candidate and make sure they can do the job, but then what do we need to do to get that potential to performance when they actually show up? You can really use science to maximize your recruiting effectiveness, and not only in the process, but also in the content of your recruitment. It's really interesting. We often see people use the science for only one of those pieces. So they'll use a pre-employment assessment, they'll use that data point there to identify, as I mentioned earlier, that sort of potential to perform. And that's the only place that science gets placed into the actual process. But there's another piece there that often gets missed, and it's the actual systematic use of the process itself can also be predictive. So in ensuring that we use science to make sure that everyone follows the process exactly as is, we can then take all the data from those pieces of the puzzle and really use science to identify, what's most predictive. So is the assessment you're using 50% predictive of performance? Maybe the structured interview is 30% predictive. And maybe the market survey is now showing that it's 20% predictive of performance. So the more systematic we can be in our process, the more scientific it can become, even though we do have art in there helping us really inform our decision. Using it in the process and in the content really drives that ability to turn that potential into performance and validate it coming back. So when we talk about different levels of predictability in the recruitment process, what we're saying is that if we're systematic and we can score every candidate on each piece of the process, we can then follow those candidates through and see who's really strong and who might be struggling in certain areas and actually bring it back to what happened in the process. And we can look at how each piece of their sort of scores or what we identified about them in the process is actually impacting their performance now. And then we can do the math and use the science to really see if someone is really, really strong on their, say, assessment, then absolutely we know 50% of the time they're going to be a strong performer. But then if we add in the market survey, we can add 20% to that ability to predict a strong performer. And then we add in the interview, and that can give us that last piece. So it's really all about validating, what's in your process, what's working, and what's really working when it comes to someone who's now a top performer and someone who's really strong.